You know that Ethiopia does not follow BC or AD on their calendar. Therefore, they do not believe in that crucifictional resurrection story that changes every year in order to line up with the full moon on Sunday. In other words, Good Friday could land as early as March 26th and as late as April 28th. In other words, Jesus was never crucified, and if he was, they have no idea on what date it happened. All they know is that Easter has to line up with a pagan full moon worship. So let's watch what else they try to hide from us. Do you know this? 70% of African mountains are found in Ethiopia. So when you enter into the mountains of Israel, you're in Ethiopia. And notice about Ethiopia. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity is not Eastern Orthodox. Ethiopia is predominantly a Christian country with around 2/3 of its people belonging to a Christian church. So some are saying one thing while others are saying other. So as you could clearly see, Good Friday always occurs on the Friday before Easter Sunday. So if Easter Sunday moves to line up with a full moon, then Good Friday moves. In other words, it has nothing to do with a crucifixion. So Good Friday for the next 20 years could land as early as March 26th in 2028 and as late as April 28th in 2040. So watch the debate by an Ethiopian.
When we look at the extant records of the first, second, third century Christians, all of them say that these are efficacious for salvation, that they're not just symbolic, that they have an actual deifying effect on the person that receives them. So I guess my question is, how can you say that you're following what the Bible says if your interpretation of the Bible is not lining up with the people that directly receive the Bible and even compile the canon of the New Testament from now?
Remember, Ethiopia has the oldest, most complete Bible on earth. Yet still, he's given credit to the Romans because he's part of the Tewahedo Church, which used to be an annex of Rome. So he's going to refer to the Roman church fathers. And who are they? These guys, the apostolic fathers. Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Papias of Hierapolis, and Quadratus of Athens. And listen to their stories. Clement, his body was buried in Rome and his head was somewhere in Ukraine, according to their traditions. So he was born, they have no idea, but he died supposedly in 99 AD with no birthday. They don't know when he was born. Just like Ignatius of Loyola. So they know how he looks, even though he was eaten by lions. So how could you draw someone that got eaten by lions, who no one mentioned or spoke about back then? While they talk about Polycarp of Smyrna. So according to some, his death is in dispute. While Papias of Hierapolis, they say he was born in 60 AD and died in 130 AD, while other reports have him being born in 70 AD and dying in 155 CE. In other words, they just made him up in the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, just like Quadratus of Athens. So his burial site is unknown. They don't know, they don't know when he was born. They just know he existed. Why? Because someone wrote about him in the 15th century. Just like Paul. They just made up Paul in the 15th century. They say his body, his head was beheaded. So his head is in Rome somewhere, while his empty tomb of him is in Lateran. So in other words, his body and head and the empty tomb is in two different places, which is similar to Barnabas. So Barnabas got stoned by a group of people. He was stoned to death by a mob. Yet, still, they cannot identify any of them. Just like this.
If that's true, then what's the history of why so many millions upon millions don't think it's the case?
You could argue the same thing about why so many people don't believe in the gospel. I mean, that's just...
No, but who are the people? I want you to say the names, the church fathers, and who you're referring to on both sides of it.
So you get it, the church fathers, they don't have their birth dates. They just claim that they died. They have the year of birth for some, but they don't know when. Some, they don't know when they died. Some were beheaded. Some were burnt, so you can't identify them today. So those are the ones that are referred to as the church fathers, as if Christianity started in Rome. So this guy from Ethiopia should know better.
Well, there's no both sides because we don't have any records of anyone that believes it's
So
symbolic.
you're saying it's later with Luther?
Not even with Luther, because Luther famously said he would rather drink blood with the Pope than
So then how did it come about?
It came with Ulrich Zwingli and some of the radical reformers, which is like, what, 500 years ago.
Right, so only approximately 500 years ago you started hearing of what happened in the first century. In other words, 500 years ago, in the 1500s, they started making up stories and creating fictional historians and placing them in the first century. Then they made fictitious church leaders that have been beheaded and burned to death, so you can't identify them. And for some strange reason, they don't have any family tree. So you can't be like, yo, he's a descendant of so-and-so. No, all of them were made up in the 15th century. Therefore, no one wrote about them in the first century. Just like no one wrote about Jesus in the first century. In other words, follow Jah, not man. And know this about Ethiopia.
Family, another lie, the Atlantic Ocean. You see this ancient map of before 1800s? Look at the name, Oceanius Aethiopicus. You see Atlantic Sea? Let's zoom in, Oceanius Aethiopicus. And if we look at the left side over here, we see the depiction of African brothers meeting the American brothers. Look at this family. There are historical references to Ethiopia in the Americas, particularly.
Why? Because they have inscriptions in Ge'ez. Because in the beginning was a word and it wasn't in Hebrew, it was in Ge'ez. Why? Because Ethiopia has the oldest language. Why? Because Ethiopia is the first civilization. So in the beginning, they spoke Ge'ez and they went around the world.
In South America and the Caribbean. And look here, family, the Ethiopian Ocean, many pre-18th century maps labeled the Atlantic Ocean as the Ethiopian Ocean. And look at the map, family. This is how we know they are talking about the Caribbean and South America, Turtle Island, and all the animals depicting each Caribbean island. Look, family, 1898. The Dawes Rolls forced indigenous people to register as either Indian or Negro, stripped away black indigenous heritage. So if you wonder what this has to do with Tartaria and the orphans, look at this.
Follow Jah, not man. Remember, Ethiopia is first, and it's written that we are all born in Zion. Hence, we are all Ethiopians.
Some kind of Johnny come lately, talking about them make some kind of discovery. I man is the living anthropology. I man is the living archaeology.